All right. Good morning, Batavia. I hope you all are having a great week without me. Actually, no, I hope you're having a horrible week without me, and I hope your sad and unfortunate lives are now brightened because you hear the melodious tones of my voice. Of course, that's just me and my wishful thinking. But right now, we're going to move on and we're going to talk about 1968, the year that changed America. So, 1968. We're going to talk about it as a transformative year. Of course, we're going to talk about it as it plays its role in the Vietnam War and how the events in America affect the Vietnam War and events in the Vietnam War affect America. So, the very first thing we're going to talk about is in January. We're going to break this down in 12 months. We're going to go through these 12 months one at a time. January 1968, the very end of January, we have the Tet Offensive in Vietnam. This is by far the most significant event that happens in Vietnam, quite possibly the most significant event that happens in 1968 because it has so many different ramifications. What we're talking about here is that in Vietnam, they celebrate the Lunar New Year, much like the Chinese New Year. It's based on the lunar calendar, and so it's between sometimes in January, sometimes in February, depending on when the full moon is that starts the new year for the Vietnamese or the Chinese or most of these Southeast Asian countries. The Lunar New Year in Vietnam, called Tet, was traditionally the time of a 5-day ceasefire. Tet is usually 5 days. There are 2 days before the New Year and 3 days during and after the New Year, where friends and family will get together, eat food, exchange gifts. It's kind of like Thanksgiving and Christmas all rolled into one big 5-day holiday. Well, we usually observed a 5-day ceasefire during this time period. But on the evening at the beginning of Tet, the North Vietnamese army broke the ceasefire and began attacking American forces. To be completely honest, the Tet Offensive actually happened the week prior. You see, the North Vietnamese had been giving out rumors of some big major engagement, and the North Vietnamese knew that the American spies were probably picking up on a lot of this stuff. And so what they did was they did a little sideshow action where they were basically attacking Khe Sanh, which is a major Air Force base in South Vietnam. The Battle of Khe Sanh, 6,000 Marines were surrounded by somewhere in the neighborhood of 17,000 North Vietnamese, and they were cut off. They were isolated. They were under siege. The Americans, in order to relieve the siege, had to airlift ammunition and food and supplies in by basically coming down on these huge transport ships, not even touching down on the runway because the runway wasn't safe because the North Vietnamese had shelled it. They had basically shelled huge holes in portions of the runway, and as soon as the Americans could fix it, they would basically be shelled again. So the transports would basically fly down and then just push the stuff out the back with huge parachutes, and it would come out on skids, and some of it would be good and some of it would break, and oops. But that's how they would get the stuff. But the siege lasted. It began the week before Tet, and it lasted for several months, from January 21st all the way up to April 6th before the siege was broken, for about 3 months. And it continued on even into July of 1968 when the Americans finally left the base. They destroyed and left the base, and then the North Vietnamese basically moved into the area. But Khe Sanh was originally thought to be the major event. The Americans thought this was the major event. So when the actual Tet Offensive started, a lot of the American forces were a bit slow to pick up on it. In the Tet Offensive proper, The North Vietnamese, the Viet Cong forces, attacked every major city and 36 of the 44 provincial capitals in South Vietnam, including the national capital of Saigon. 85,000 NVA regular soldiers and several 100,000 Viet Cong. I've seen estimates on this vary widely, from 100,000 to 500,000 Viet Cong were involved in this. It was a coordinated attack. They all happened on the same day, more or less around the same time. And it wasn't so much the scope and scale of the attacks, but it was the penetration of the attacks that made the Tet Offensive so significant. We had, of course, the huge assault at Khe Sanh, but we had Hue, the ancient imperial capital of Hue, was captured and held for several months, and the North Vietnamese engaged in quite a few war crimes there, basically going around killing anybody who had ever supported the South Vietnamese government or the American army. And of course, the attack on Saigon. The attack on Saigon was one of the most significant events of the war that shocked the American people. I mean, the American people had been told by the Johnson administration that they were winning the war, that the war was almost won, that the North Vietnamese were on their heels, they were falling back here, there, and everywhere, that America was running the tables on them. And this basically exposed that for an absolute bold-faced lie. You cannot hide thousands of dead bodies coming home every month. You cannot hide the news reports that show the embassy being attacked by a suicide squad of Viet Cong soldiers. I mean, the embassy wasn't held but 6 hours, but still, you had people that were actually able to blow a hole in the fence, get inside, and threaten the U.S. embassy. Only one Marine and 4 military police guards were killed in the exchange, and on the flip side, you had 18 Viet Cong killed and 1 captured. But the very fact that they were able to penetrate all the way into the U.S. embassy in the city center was a psychological blow that America never really recovered from. It was something that America really had to take stock in itself and think, well, if we aren't, I mean, it's one thing to be involved in the Vietnam War if we are getting ready to win, if we are winning the war, but if we are not winning the war, why are we there? And so you have a huge boost to the anti-war movement because of the Tet Offensive. Tet is a military defeat for the North Vietnamese. However, the psychological and the political aspects of Tet make Tet a victory for the North Vietnamese. Because of Tet, North Vietnam has a lot of bargaining power and causes a lot of political turmoil in the United States. In February, we have the execution of Nguyen Van Lim. He was a Viet Cong captain, and of course he did something horrible. I think he slit the throats of an ARVN colonel and his wife, basically slipping into the home, killed his wife, his family, his kids, his mother-in-law. I mean, killed them all. And they drug him to the police captain. And on live TV, well, I don't know whether it was live, but it was recorded. In an incident that was recorded, the police captain basically calmly walked outside and shot this man in the head, no trial, summarily executed him in the middle of the street. Black and white images of this were plastered on newspapers worldwide. And while it was the action of a member of the South Vietnamese government and not an action of an American, it still reflected very, very poorly on the Americans, and America got a lot of flack for this, a lot of heat for this. It made the anti-war effort that much more pronounced and that much more galvanized. It gave the anti-war effort that much more ammunition. Also during February, we have the Memphis sanitation workers strike. This is the thing that brings Dr. King to Memphis in 1968. 2 black sanitation workers were crushed to death by a faulty garbage truck. The garbage truck they were working on basically crushed them to death while they were on the job. And so the sanitation workers go on strike, refusing to show up for work, striking for better pay and safer equipment. Later on, this will prove very significant in the life of Dr. King. But also in 1968, February of 1968, we have Walter Cronkite's Vietnam War editorial. Walter Cronkite was a CBS reporter. He was very respected for his honesty and integrity. As the events of the Tet offensive unfolded, he was sent to Vietnam to report firsthand. And when he came back, he delivered a devastating editorial and critique of what he saw in the Vietnam War. In his final moments of his report for Vietnam, he gave the following shocking personal analysis. He said, and I quote, "To say that we are closer to victory today is to believe in the face of the evidence the optimists who have been wrong in the past. To suggest we are on the edge of defeat is to yield to unreasonable pessimism. To say that we are mired in stalemate seems the only realistic yet unsatisfactory conclusion. On the off chance that military and political analysts are right, in the next few months we must test the enemy's intentions in case this is indeed the last big gasp before negotiations. But it is increasingly clear to this reporter that the only rational way out then will be to negotiate, not as victors, but as an honorable people who lived up to their pledge to defend democracy and did the best they could." It is reported that when Lyndon Johnson saw this broadcast, he said, "Well, I've just lost Middle America and I've just lost the war." Cronkite was so important to Middle America. He was so important to the average American. He was basically the voice of the average American. And when he says that the only realistic yet unsatisfactory conclusion is that we are mired in a stalemate, well, that has huge political ramifications for the war and for the politicians involved in the war. As a result, 1968 is an election year. And this is going to have immediate consequences for Johnson. Johnson's facing re-election, and unlike almost every other sitting president, he actually has people that are seriously challenging him in the primary. Of course, Donald Trump has people challenging him in the primary. It is pretty unprecedented for even Donald Trump to be challenged, but of course Donald Trump is not being challenged to any significant degree. Here, though, Johnson's facing a candidate who is making a serious challenge. Senator Eugene McCarthy was convinced by many of the anti-war movement to campaign as an anti-war candidate, and he gained 42% of the New Hampshire primary to Johnson's 49%. This was a huge slap in the face of the sitting president and showed that Johnson was incredibly vulnerable. And as a result, when sharks smell blood in the water, they come a-running. Then 4 days later, another candidate, a very popular candidate, a very dangerous candidate, Bobby Kennedy, joins the race. Bobby Kennedy joins the race as another anti-war candidate and has with him the legacy of his brother, John F. Kennedy. So he has a lot of clout. And that was a huge thing that happened. Also on March 16th, we would have, of course, the My Lai massacre, which we discussed in the previous lesson. While they wouldn't hear about it for over a year later, the My Lai massacre did occur in the year 1968, which just goes to show you how heavy and how serious the year 1968 is. I've talked about 1968 before. It is the most significant year in America's history, period, for so many different reasons. And you can see we're already in March, and it's heavy already, and we've got several more months to go. Finally, in March, at the very end of March, Johnson drops out of the race. Johnson asks for airtime on the nation's television broadcast networks and says he's going to talk about the Vietnam War, and does so. He talks about the Vietnam War for 40 minutes, but the real bombshell of what he had to say was in the last few minutes of his broadcast. He says, and I quote, "With America's sons in the field far away, with America's future under challenge right here at home, with our hopes and the world's hopes for peace in the balance every day, I do not believe that I should devote an hour or a day of my time to any personal partisan causes or to any duties other than the awesome duties of this office, the presidency of your country. Accordingly, I shall not seek and I will not accept the nomination of my party for another term as your president. But let men everywhere know, however, that a strong and confident and vigilant America stands ready tonight to seek an honorable peace and stands ready tonight to defend an honored cause, whatever the price, whatever the burden, whatever the sacrifice that duty may require." That bombshell blew the race wide open. With Johnson dropping out, it basically tears the New Deal coalition to pieces because several candidates join and each of them grapple for various pieces of the people who tend to vote Democratic. For instance, the young students, the intellectuals, and the liberals, they gravitated towards McCarthy, while minorities, Catholics, and the poor went towards Kennedy. Eventually, even Johnson's own vice president, Hubert Humphrey, declares his attention. He gains those candidates pledged to President Johnson, but he also campaigns, brings with him the labor unions and the big city party bosses like Mayor Daley of Chicago, where the Democratic nominating convention would be held that summer. And the final group of the New Deal coalition, the conservative Southern Democrats, also known as Dixiecrats, they tended to split their vote between Hubert Humphrey and George Wallace, the governor of Alabama, who was running as a third-party candidate that summer, as a states' rights candidate against desegregation. So the political machine that was built by Franklin Delano Roosevelt is torn to pieces in 1968 over the Vietnam War and over the issues of segregation. April 4th, 1968, Dr. Martin Luther King is assassinated, sparking riots in every major American city except Boston, Los Angeles, and Indianapolis. The riots for Martin Luther King last many days and would have an impact on African American protests over the next year. Immediately, the effect can be felt in the Columbia University protests. The Columbia University protests were protesting the creation of a segregated gym facility and the university's connection to Vietnam War. There were two main groups that were protesting. There were the SDS, the Students of the Democratic Society, and the SAS, the Student Afro Society. And while they were both protesting the university, they were protesting for different reasons. The gym that was being built was comically referred to as Jim Crow by the students, was the primary focus of the SAS, and the university's links to the Defense Department think tank that was funded and supported by Columbia University was the primary object of the SDS, the Students for Democratic Society. When the two groups occupied Hamilton Hall, they split along racial lines. The SAS students wanted the predominantly white students to leave Hamilton Hall so that the SAS students could focus on the protests of the gym. After a few days of hurt feelings and separation, the SDS students left and occupied the Low Library office. Well, it was called the Low Library, but it was actually the offices of the president and other administrators. And so they actually occupied the office of the president of the university. They also occupied the architecture building and a couple other buildings and campus as well. But these two groups predominantly split along racial lines, basically protesting. I mean, they supported the others' causes, but they had other main focuses, and so they basically had two simultaneous protests going on at Columbia University at the same time. At the end of April, these protests came to a crashing end when the NYPD came in to quash the demonstrations. The SAS students were cleared out peacefully as African American lawyers were there ready to represent the students in court. And the NYPD used an African American squad of soldiers, not soldiers, but a policeman to clear out that hall because Martin Luther King had been assassinated earlier that month. The students knew that any heavy-handed tactics that the university used against the African American soldiers would backfire on them, and it would have. So the peaceful ending there was a win for the university. On the other side, though, the white students got the crap beat out of them. They got trucked, seriously. The buildings occupied by the white students were, it was a bloodbath. Approximately 132 students were injured, 4 faculty members and 12 police officers injured, while over 700 protesters were arrested. And it didn't even start there. The violence continued into the following day with students armed with sticks battling with the officers. There was one officer that got paralyzed. A student jumped out of a second-floor window and I don't know whether he tried to come off the top rope of a wrestling ring. I don't know what he was trying to do, but he basically flying tackled him from the second-floor window and broke his back. So it was some pretty serious and crazy stuff going on at Columbia University. And this kind of stuff would actually be replicated in several other universities, especially in California and Berkeley and UCLA and other California universities as well. May 1968. Oh, wait, we're not done with the Tet Offensive. There is a second phase to Tet called Mini Tet in May. If you didn't think you had gotten enough Tet back in January, just wait. We got some more for you. Once again, they attacked Saigon multiple times. The casualty rates were much higher on the Americans this time than they were in the first time, making May the highest monthly casualty figure of the entire Vietnam War. Once again, they hope to spark a general uprising, the NVA do and the Viet Cong, and once again they fail to do so. The North Vietnamese believed that the majority of the people in the South were with them, and so they believed that if they fought the Americans, that the South Vietnamese would rise up with them. Never happened. And so they died once again. June 1968, Robert Kennedy is assassinated. He just won the California primary on June 4th, and that same night, late into the early morning of June 5th, he had just completed a celebration in the hall with the supporters, gave a speech, blah, blah, was on his way to the press room and decided to take a shortcut through the kitchen because he was told, hey, there's a shortcut here through the kitchen. He was shaking hands with a Latino busboy. And it was at that time that a man named Sirhan Sirhan, a Palestinian, happened to be in the same kitchen and had a .22 pistol and shot Kennedy 3 times in the head. One grazing his forehead, one lodging harmlessly in his neck. Well, it wasn't harmlessly, but he could have survived it. And the other entering just behind his right ear, I believe coming from the side of his right ear and going back through his skull, damaging all 3 major parts of the brain: the cerebellum, the cerebrum, and the brainstem. Kennedy lasted for 26 hours, but there was virtually no way that he was going to survive that. They operated on him, they performed surgery on him to remove the bone fragments and the pieces of the bullet, but so much damage had been done to very essential portions of the brain that Kennedy did not make it. The motivation for Sirhan Sirhan's assassination attempt was simply because Kennedy had support, because of Kennedy's support for the nation of Israel, and it was so out of left field, so shocking, and the nation once again grieving, rocked by another assassination. King assassinated, Kennedy assassinated a few months later. And of course you have the double whammy of Kennedy's the second of the Kennedy brothers to have been assassinated, all for politics. It's quite shocking in the American people. July 1968. This one won't be known for a while, but the creation of the Phoenix program, the CIA's Phoenix program in South Vietnam, the goal was to infiltrate and neutralize the VC in South Vietnam. Now, that sounds great. The problem comes in how they go about doing it. Using infiltration, torture, capture, basically kidnapping, counterterrorism, and assassination, the CIA sought to identify and destroy the Viet Cong. Great cause, really crappy way of doing your job. This became a huge nuclear hot potato when the issue came out and was quickly passed on to the South Koreans. Now, it was fairly effective. They had neutralized 81,740 people suspected of VC membership, of whom 26,369 were killed, and the rest surrendered or were captured. The problem came in that people involved in it began to use, especially South Vietnamese individuals, began to use it for ways to eliminate people that they didn't necessarily like. They weren't necessarily Viet Cong, but they were people that were, problematic to them, and so they would call them VC, and boom, they get wrapped up in the system. So it becomes a way to assassinate people that you don't necessarily like, and you get to use the Americans to do it. This becomes a huge, ugly liability on the part of the Americans. And so when it comes out, it's just one of those things that happened in 1968 that Americans are like, really? Kind of wish we could have had a do-over in that year all around. In August of 1968, it gets just even better. The Tale of Two Conventions. On August 5th and the 8th, the Republicans hold their national nominating convention and choose Richard Nixon and his vice president, Spiro Agnew. Yay! Great thing is, it was a quiet, peaceful, and very orderly convention. Okay? And it would look so awesome compared to the hot mess that the Democrats put on just a few weeks later. August 22nd through the 30th, Democrats' convention held in Chicago, Illinois. From the beginning, it was a disaster. There were multiple candidates. No one had enough support to win the election outright. However, heavy-handed maneuvering by Richard Daley, the mayor of Chicago, and Johnson himself causes Hubert Humphrey to win on the first ballot. Also, the anti-war candidates tried to pass a peace plank in the Democratic Party, basically forcing the Democratic Party to support a peace in Vietnam, basically policy, and it was defeated, even though of all the delegates that had voted in state primaries, 80% of the votes cast in these state primaries were cast for peace candidates. Now, here's the crazy thing. If you look at the way primaries were run in 1968, you will realize something. Not every state has a primary. Primaries do not become a big thing until after this election. Because of this election, because so many people had made their will known that they were for peace, and they were basically ignored, steamrolled, and bowled over by huge party bosses and backroom deals, cutting deals to get their favorite son elected as the candidate. Hubert Humphrey, the vice president, Johnson's vice president, and the supposed heir apparent of the Johnson administration policies, is chosen to run as the Democratic candidate, and the convention melts down. So many people who were so against the war, they basically turn the Democratic National Convention into a circus. And it's not just a circus on the inside, it's a circus on the outside, because anti-war protesters are in Chicago, and they are there to put on a show. On the evening of the 28th, the night that Humphrey is he basically is nominated, 10,000 protesters take to the streets of Chicago, walking down Michigan Avenue, and are basically, they run right into the police, or basically the police run right into them. And in what the federal government investigators afterwards would only qualify and say that basically it was a police riot. The police basically walked in and started swinging their clubs indiscriminately, beating people about the head, breaking people's faces, knocking people down, indiscriminately firing tear gas into the crowd, so much so that Hubert Humphrey basically succumbed to it while he was taking a shower in his hotel room just down the street. And unfortunately for the Chicago police, it happened on live TV for about 17 minutes. The world watched as the Chicago police brutalized the protesters, all while the protesters chanted, "Hey, the whole world is watching. The whole world is watching. The whole world is watching." All told, after 4 days and nights of violence, 668 people had been arrested, 425 demonstrators had been treated at temporary medical facilities, 200 were treated on the spot, 400 given first aid for tear gas, and 110 went to the hospital. A total of 192 police officers were injured. And all for that, the Democrats get a candidate in Hubert Humphrey that nobody really wants. The Democrats try to put on the best face, but they aren't above throwing a few pot shots from the podium. Famously, Senator Abraham Ribicoff used to speech to criticize Mayor Daley, saying, "With George McGovern as president of the United States, we wouldn't have to have Gestapo tactics in the streets of Chicago." To which Mayor Daley says some very nice and pleasant words to him from the third row. This is Daley right here, basically with his hand in his mouth, calling Senator Ribicoff a very wonderful man. Anyway, moving on. And that's the Democratic National Convention. It was a disaster on live television, and the Democrats gained no fans from it. And in many ways, people say that basically Richard Nixon was elected president because of this convention. Basically, he was elected right here because he was the law and order guy. He was the guy that was there to bring law and order. The Republican the Republican process was orderly in fashion, and the Democratic Party was just eating its young, basically tearing itself apart from the inside. Oh, guess what happens in September? You didn't have enough Tet yet? We got some more. A heaping helping of it for you. Phase 3 of the Tet Offensive. This time they decide to stay away from the major cities, but they still decide, and I don't understand the logic here, to attack significant American military facilities in the north near the DMZ. As a result, the NVA suffered huge casualties. An estimated 29,000 of the NVAs to 700 American. I'm not sure why they wanted to do this, but while it was a huge loss to the North Vietnamese, it still showed that, hey, you thought that the North Vietnamese were ready to quit? Dude, we've got 30,000 people we can toss away. We don't need them. We'll just, we got more. We'll make some more babies. Send them down to you again. So at some point, the American soldiers like, when's enough? Like, are these guys ever going to quit? Well, maybe they're not ever going to quit. Maybe we're fighting a war of attrition and we are on the losing side here. Once again, in October 1968, we have the Black Power salute of Tommy Smith and John Carlos. I mentioned this before when we talked about the civil rights movement. But it happens here in 1968. It happens in the midst of all this. It happens in the aftermath of the Martin Luther King assassination. It happens in the aftermath of the war in Vietnam slowly descending into chaos. It happens right after the Democratic National Convention, where grown men are basically acting like children and no one can say nice things to each other and no one can get along. And here we have two excellent African American athletes raising their hands in a Black Power salute. You'll notice they are wearing their sandals, their shoes, on their shoulders, around their necks. They have their shoes. They're on barefoot on the podium to protest poverty, the fact that there's so much poverty in the world and in the United States. And they have beads around their neck to symbolize slavery and the lynchings that are happening in the United States. The rest of the world thought it was a fine thing. Black power. Hey, sure, more power to you. In America, these guys were excoriated. They were basically evicted from the Olympics. And they faced significant backlash at home for their act. Like I said, many Americans interpret this as them giving a black eye. And this is a year where America is getting a dozen black eyes. They're getting black eyes every month. And this is just one more. And they're like, many Americans feel like, hey, stop. We can only take so much. But from the African American perspective, this is the perfect time to bring this up. We need these kind of recognition, especially you just assassinated Martin Luther King. Black power is what we need to rally around, but the white America was not ready to receive that. Also in October 1968, the most egregious act in 1968. Interestingly, the only people who knew about it in 1968, though, was Johnson and his administration. We found indisputable proof of it now, but even then, the only people that knew about it were Johnson, and he didn't have enough proof to go and accuse anybody. What basically is happening is Johnson is negotiating a peace talks with the North Vietnamese, and it's a complicated process. You got to have Americans on one side, the Americans and South Vietnamese on one side, and then you have the Chinese, you have the Russians, and you have the North Vietnamese on another side. And the North Vietnamese want the Viet Cong also to be represented. Okay. Now, the government of South Vietnam is not too keen on facing three other people across the table with the Russians, Chinese, and the North Vietnamese. They definitely aren't okay with having traitors in their own country, the South Vietnamese Viet Cong, represented and giving a bargaining position at the table as well. However, initially they had agreed to join Johnson at the bargaining table. But in steps Richard Nixon, who uses a Republican fundraiser, Anna Chennault, with connections to the South Vietnamese government, to throw a monkey wrench into the situation. Chennault passes word to the South Vietnamese ambassador that, hey, the president, his name is Nguyen Van Thieu, should withdraw from the talks. Hang out. If you hang out and don't commit to the talks, when the Republicans win, you'll get much better bargaining terms. In essence, what Nixon is doing is he is sabotaging peace talks for a American war, basically committing to destroying these peace talks. Also, he can look good later when he wins. Because if Johnson gets these talks, the Democrats look good, and potentially Hubert Humphrey looks good, and potentially Hubert Humphrey might win the election in just a week away. But when Nixon gets the South Vietnamese president to withdraw just days before the election, it's over. Johnson looks bad. The Democrats look bad by default. Johnson's administration looks like it can't get anything right, like it's a bumbling idiot. And Nixon sails to a huge electoral college win in the election. Nixon basically committed treason against his own country in order to get elected president. Now, how serious was this? As we will see, who knows? The negotiation process, when we talk about Nixon's administration, it takes forever because there are many times that the North Vietnamese basically fail to bargain in good faith. That being said, it was a huge step over the line, and Johnson was furious. However, Johnson was basically the only one that knew about it. He and his administration. They had bugged the South Vietnamese president's phone, and so they heard the phone call as it happened. They know who was what the people were trying to do. They just didn't know that Johnson had been the one to order it. Nixon. Johnson didn't know if Nixon had been the one to order it. Johnson suspected it, and Nixon denied it. But we now know from notes in Nixon's own presidential library that he did, in fact, order this to happen, and that it came from the top, which honestly isn't surprising. Hey, we're talking about the president who gave us Watergate. Deny all you want, dude. You're a crook. We know you for a crook. All right, 1968. It's been a year of total crap so far, but hey, at least it ends on a good note. The final moments of 1968 are the Apollo 8 mission. It's where the Apollo 8 astronauts were the first humans to see the dark side of the moon. Well, it's not always dark, but basically it's the side of the moon that doesn't ever face the Earth. And it was the first time the astronauts had ever been in orbit around the moon. Every other Apollo mission, every other Mercury and Gemini mission had been in low Earth orbit. There had not been any other time that I'm aware of that astronauts had been outside of Earth orbit, had basically gone to the moon. And this was the first group. They circled the moon 10 times, and while there, they delivered a Christmas Eve broadcast where they read from the creation story in the book of Genesis. They also took that image, the Earthrise image, and it is often credited, it's one of the most famous pictures of planet Earth, and it's often credited with basically creating the modern environmental movement, as many people saw the Earth for the first time from outside of Earth, from a place where it looks small and vulnerable and fragile. And many people on Earth began to realize that, we only get one of these, and we probably ought to take a pretty good care of it. And thus the modern environmental movement was born. Now, we'll talk more about the environmental movement on another lesson, but this is where it is born. And this is the year 1968. As you can see, this is probably one of the longest videos I have created. It's definitely the longest I've created so far, and probably one of the longest I'll create ever. But it was a huge year. It's 1968, big time, huge, massive year. Lots of stuff going on. Hope you enjoyed it, and I will catch you later.